This episode of Around the Layout is brought to you by Spring Creek Model Trains. Family owned for nearly 25 years, Spring Creek is your destination for model trains. Check out springcreekmodeltrains.com for a wide variety of offerings from today's top manufacturers and exclusive products found nowhere else. Whether in Deschler, Nebraska, or at a train show near you, stop in and say wow. To see where they'll be next, visit their website at springcreekmodeltrains.com. New from Home Shops, USRA rebuilt steel boxcars by Atlas Model Railroad Company. Available in both HO and N scale, these beautiful cars feature 7 freelance railroads you've come to know and love, including the Cat Mountain Santa Fe, Delta Lines, Ohio Southern, St. Louis County Railway, Virginia Midland, Miami Valley Railroad, and the Virginian in Ohio. Perfect for the transition era modeler or a classic collector, these cars are a must-have for the freelance enthusiast. Only 50 of each road number were produced in this limited edition collection. Head to homeshops.net to reserve yours today. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Around the Layout, where model railroaders come to tell their story. My name is Ray Arnott. So glad you could join us. On today's show, we're going to be talking about the theatrical approach to model railroading. And joining me to do that, Scott Thornton. Scott, welcome to the show.
Hi, Ray. Good to be here.
Glad to see you again, Scott. Saw each other at the St. Louis RPM. You came on, with Lonnie. We talked about the St. Louis RPM. And boy, I had an absolute blast at St. Louis, and I'm sure you did too.
Oh, I had a wonderful time. You know, the St. Louis RPM is my all-time favorite RPM, although I have other favorites. But I never miss the St. Louis trip for sure. I just absolutely love everything about that RPM and had a really good time this time around too. And some of my friends from what we affectionately call the Iowa Interstate Mafia made the trip down from the Iowa City area, and we had a good time. And yeah, good time all around.
Yeah, and you were over with the Iowa Scaled Engineering folks. And a lot of really cool stuff coming out of them, which was really neat to see and great to talk to them as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Michael and Nathan, the owners of Iowa Scale, they were coming out with all kinds of new products, and they had 4 that they were announcing at the show. And so they were generating some excitement. And there were a lot of other new vendors there that I had an opportunity to go check out their wares, and it was really fun. A lot of 3D printed vendors, and you know, that's always interesting because, as we all know, 3D printing is just exploding in the quantity and the quality. And gosh, who knows what we're going to see?
Well, as vast as the world is and the many things that are in it, now we have the capability for it within 3D printing. If you can drum it up, like, for example, I talked to one 3D printer and they were saying, hey, is there something that we're missing? Something that's like, well, sheds. I need a shed. And they printed me a shed. It was like, you know, just dream it up, think it up, and they can print it. And it's definitely filling a void in our hobby to a point where you can pretty much get anything you want now.
That's right. And I'm even dabbling in a little CAD design myself. And I don't consider myself the smartest bulb out there. So trying to learn a CAD program is kind of a steep learning curve for me. But the listeners might be interested. Some of them might know about a new app that's come on the market in the last couple of years called Plasticity. And it's a CAD program, but it's geared more toward designers and artists versus engineers. And so it's more intuitive. Some of the CAD programs can be quite layered and quite technical, but Plasticity is a little bit easier. And plus, it's got a huge YouTube tutorial following. So if anybody's ever interested in that, I know there's a rabbit trail here, but that might be an app they might want to check out.
Yeah, for sure. That's it's wild just how that is all increasing and gaining popularity. And as prices start to come down a little bit on that technology and it becomes a little bit more common, boy, I think we're just going to see a lot more of that pop up in our hobby.
Oh, you're dead on right. And that particular app is very reasonable cost-wise and very deep, very layered. I mean, layered in terms of lots of features, but again, it's more the interface is more intuitive for the right brainers like myself to try and understand. So I'm in the process, albeit slowly, trying to put together an Alco HH660 shell. And eventually I hope to print it out in O scale. So wish me luck.
Yeah, going big with the O scale stuff, but yeah, that's pretty cool. And it's just, again, amazing the stuff that we saw, 3D printing, and again, going back to, the technology stuff that we saw there, and, whether it be, the technology that, the folks at Iowa Scaled are working with, or, the ability to print 3D print signage. We saw folks that were doing some, miniature signs in such tight detail. It's just really getting tighter and tighter, and that much more amazing.
Oh, those signs were incredible. And I am absolutely buying some of those because I'm going to need quite a few for my layout. I'm trying to remember. Do you remember the name of that vendor? It's escaping
Yeah, it
me now.
was scalesigns.com.
You think I'd remember a name like that?
You know what was really amazing about the St. Louis RPM I really enjoyed was the camaraderie. It was just an amazing atmosphere, great camaraderie, getting to see a lot of different people, great place to meet, right in the center of the country, right? It was a great spot, just a lot of good things going about it. So I'm looking forward to figuring out a way to get back there again in the following years.
Well, I hope so. And you're absolutely right. I mean, it's friends reconnecting and making new friends, and everybody's passionate about the hobby and they're excited to be there. And so you can't really ask for anything more.
No, that's great. So the topic at hand tonight, we're going to be talking about, again, the theatrical approach to model railroading. And I know you have a passion for this topic and you've started to apply it. It's really no surprise with this kind of mentality. You've talked about the play aspect of operations and the theatrical look of layouts, and taking some of those theories and applying them. But again, no surprise that you spend a lot of time and have collaborated with the ISE guys, because a lot of what they're doing too adds to that effect and in those types of things. So really interested in hearing your take on this and some of the ways that you can take these theater type things and bring your layout to life.
Yeah, well, this is a big thing for me personally, Ray. And I don't want anybody in the listening audience to think that I'm the end all or an expert in any area, but these are just things that intrigue me and really kind of stoke the fire of the passion when it comes to model railroading. And what I like to say is bring the outside inside. All of our layouts are indoors except for some of the garden railroaders, but the vast majority of us are building our layouts in some interior space. But how can we take the feel of the prototype and bring it into our layouts? And that's why I like to call it the theatrical approach. Lance Mindheim has touched on this in some of his information, like his books, and when you hear him on different podcasts or in his articles, he kind of preaches along similar lines. Lance has got a real artistic sense, and I appreciate what he has to say along these lines too, because he thinks in terms of negative space, how to put scenes together, what you're going to add operationally, and in terms of scenery and all these different aspects that really bring the theatrical approach into the hobby. But I should give you a little background on myself. I was a professional graphic designer for 30 some odd years until I retired recently. So I approach modeling from a visual or artistic perspective for sure. And I've often thought that when one attends a theatrical performance, what you normally see there are sets that are usually minimal and are designed and built to provide context for the performance. And there's a lot of similarities on how we plan out how our layouts are going to look for the performance, which is obviously the trains moving across whatever scenes that we've created. But with that said, there's a lot of, like when you go out and look at the prototype, there's a lot of detail that you can't put in to your layout space because our layouts by nature are compressed. So we have to eliminate a lot of what we observe. So how to create a layout where we can put as much detail or lack of detail, and how we craft the visual approach so that we make an impression on the viewers and the friends who come over to operate, make an impression on them that, hey, you're really at this location, you're really in this space. I really feel like this is real, or as real as it can get for a miniature world. And that's kind of what I'm after. So I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah, it surely makes sense. And again, it's taking what you said, using that theater approach. And maybe we should, think about going to an actual play or going to the theater and think about the scenery they use, because just as much it'd be impossible for us to be able to put all of those things, all the elements that we see out in real life, nor can they do it on a stage. And it's the same way. So they pick the important things that get you to whatever the scene is, whether it be a cafe or whether it be a balcony or wherever the scene of this play is going to be. They don't put every single piece of it. They bring it to give you the impression and just sell you that that's where they are on that stage.
Right, exactly. They create a space and they include unique visual, mechanical, or auditory effects to help the audience feel that they're transported into another environment. So that's what I'm trying to do with my small branch line layout, is I want to incorporate different aspects borrowed from the theater experience that will make my layout operators feel like they're operating the real thing. And that can be from like I said, the mechanical would be the control aspect. Auditory would be the sounds that you experience. And then with the scenery or the lighting, that would be the visual aspect, or how things are laid out within the layout space. So all of that in combination. And some people will say, well, that's obvious. Well, yeah, it is obvious, but then it isn't obvious because, again, if you listen to Lance, like I mentioned, he goes into a lot of different detail specifics about how we can put our layouts together so that they look even more realistic. Like you and I earlier, Ray, we were talking about how some layouts, when you go into them, every square inch is filled with buildings or specific scenery. There's no negative space. There's no breathable space. So just being cognizant of all these different things that can help us create a theater type approach. And I would dare say, call it an impressionistic approach, because we're trying to make an impression, really, that again transports our operators in a greater way into the environment and into the realism of operating the trains, or the simulated realism.
I'm not really an expert in human behavior and psychology. I probably qualify more as a patient than I do anybody that could treat anybody, right? But
yeah, me too.
Yeah. But I think to understand a little bit of this and start to take that in, you have to understand kind of how the human mind works a bit. And I can tell you, just observing people in certain environments, and let's talk about Amherst. And this past Amherst, I was stationed by the door, and you watch people and they initially walk in, you can see the overload, right? Their mind completely overloads and they kind of freeze, and they're like, because for some reason, whatever, somebody else more qualified, Joe Mame or, Dan Dosa, or I'm thinking of some other ones that, understand human behavior better, but I understand it enough that you can be overwhelmed very quickly by a lot of things going on and not knowing where to focus. And
right.
You talk about some of those layouts, they're amazing. And I think they've done a lot of great things modeling wise, but as far as how the mind can process it, it could be one of those cases where less is more, because your brain doesn't know, your eyes don't know where to look. They don't know what to process.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because this is a good transition to something else I wanted to tie in to the whole theatrical theme, is when I first started building my layout, I really wanted to have all my scenes be museum quality. And so I started with my signature scene on the layout, which was a river crossing with a couple steel truss bridges. And I put a lot of time, a lot of effort, and frankly, redid the scene over and over, probably about 4 times, until I got it to the level that I thought was that museum quality. And I think I came pretty close to achieving that. But the effort was so great. And over time, what I've come to see was, even though I appreciate high levels of craftsmanship with details and techniques that help produce that museum quality, when I would go and view other modeling, I would focus on certain details initially, but after that, I never paid attention to it. It was all about the impression that the modeling gave me, or it could be a specific model, or it could be a scene. So what once meant so much to me, i.e., the museum quality craftsmanship, uber detail, I'm evolving where I don't necessarily strive for that anymore. What I strive for is kind of the old Alan McClellan good enough, at least initially, so that I can build a scene that's fairly representative, again, gives that impression of what I'm after. And then over time, I could come back to that scene later after I've got more of the layout done and add more detail to it just for my own satisfaction. But I've really come to see that even if you put every amount of detail that you could in a scene, your viewers can only take in so much. And they may take it in initially, but after that initial impression, they're going to look at it impressionistically from then on. So that's what I'm trying to do now, is just think in terms of, I want to make a good overall impression on the scenes that I'm building and not try and take them to an uber level of detail and craftsmanship.
This reminds me a lot of the conversations I had with my photography mentor, and sadly he's passed away, but he used to give me a lot of great advice. I would send him photographs that I had taken, a lot of railroad photography, some sports photography, but he would immediately say, as I thought I had this great thing of a train passing through an area and you could see buildings and this and, cars and all this stuff. And he would say, I don't know where to look. He's like, what am I supposed to be looking at? Am I looking at the building here? So it reminds me of that. It kind of the same thing. Like you talk about your bridge scene. Now, if you were to fill that river with 1,000 details of boaters and, like there's a massive party going on the water, does your eye go to that massive party on the water? Or is it paying attention to what your primary topic is, which is this bridge and a train going through it, and takes away from that?
Yeah. Or just thinking in terms of minimizing the overall scene, but maybe maximizing the actors, i.e. the trains that are moving through the scene, maybe save the detail, the uber detail for how your locomotives and your cars are detailed and weathered, because frankly, that's what we're focused most on, especially during an op session. We're focused on the engines, the movement of the cars. So we're constantly looking at those players, and the scenes kind of all blend in after a while. I mean, you might stop and appreciate some details of a scene once in a while when you're progressing through an operating session, but the main characters are the trains. So yeah, that's a good point. What I'd like to talk this evening about is take the overarching concept of a theater approach and hit several aspects, Ray. And I'll just list these now for the listeners. I was thinking we could cover things like construction aspects, operational aspects, visual aspects, audible aspects, and maybe some, as a conclusion, kind of some special effects. So we've already hit on some of the construction aspects. And again, my first point was balancing detailed craftsmanship with making progress on the layout. For example, I've got a friend that I'm close to in the hobby. I won't name him so I don't incriminate him, but he is trying to make progress on his layout, but he gets stopped because he gets fearful that he can't get enough detail into a scene right away. Well, I've tried to encourage him, just go in, start building some landforms. Step one, get some landforms into place. Like he's got all the track down, so it's just starting the scenery. Get those landforms down, maybe put some brown paint on the landforms, and you're gonna motivate yourself so much more to have those landforms in place, because you're starting to build that impression of how the terrain looks that the trains will pass through. So don't think in terms of the craftsmanship at that stage. Just get the landforms in place, maybe for the whole layout, and then move on and do that layered approach versus trying to do one scene like I did on my river scene to the point where it's way too much work, way too detailed, when you could come back later and do it. There's plenty of time to do that.
And what you're saying there, a lot of, keeping that flywheel turning too. Don't sit in an analysis paralysis state where you're not making any progress or doing anything because you're sitting there thinking about this one. Like you said, make small steps, continuously keep that flywheel turning. It doesn't have to spin at a fast rate. Just keep it moving. And that will definitely help you move along.
Yeah. And I have another friend, Clark, who always encourages anybody that he encounters to just dive in and get dirty, because our modeling, just by its nature, can get messy. I'm talking in terms of scenery now. Scenery is messy. So some of us who are more perfectionistic, we tend to hesitate. Hey, I want to craft this scene and I want it to be beautiful from the beginning. Well, guess what? It's not going to be beautiful. It's going to be messy.
Yeah.
So you have to dive in, get your hands dirty. Don't worry about making mistakes. Just go for it and start to build that impression of how things look. Plus, once you get that first layer, you could say down, is you can evaluate it. You can step back. You can come back tomorrow or a week later, and you can look at those landforms and you can say, oh, you know what? This looks good, but this doesn't look good over here. So you can go in, you could modify it, you can do whatever you need, versus doing a full scene like I did on the river and getting stressed out to the max because I've got things too well done, and then I had to go in and change them. So that whole layered approach, it's much like an artist, like a painter. Like what a painter does is he'll, what they call block in. He'll take his brush and he'll block in almost geometric shapes to create his composition and his basic form. He'll come back and he'll put tonal values over that blocked in drawing. So he gets the tone, the lights and the shadows. Then he'll come back on the next layer and he'll add more detail. Then he'll keep going via the layers until he adds layer upon layer and detail upon detail, adding the color and all the nuances to the forms before the painting is complete. That's, I think, a good approach to how we should really approach any modeling exercise, but especially scenery and in model railroad landscapes.
Yeah, and it's kind of learning to see too. And, we've talked about this with Lance Minheim as well, learning to see in layers, learning to go out when you observe a scene, the prototype, whether it be a photograph or in real life, to be able to see that it's not just this overall, this is it, but look at it in that mentality and start to break it down. Okay, what are the layers here? What's the base? And build up from there. And it takes time to learn that.
It does, but again, let's just keep the theme in mind too. Is when a modeler is approaching those landforms, he's roughing them in, he's creating that impression, and that's enough in the beginning, I think, because that's going to give you enough of a feeling of a place versus getting too detailed. Again, by layering, you can add more and more detail over time. But this helps you not only make a lot of progress, but it helps you make that impression, give a real feel for what you're after, and then everything becomes more and more clear as you go along. And something that ties into this well is another aspect on my layout that I did was with my backdrop. I know a lot of modelers use realistic backdrops where they go out and they take photos of the environments that they're modeling, and then they print those off, and they either cut them out or they, may have huge prints made of them, and then they glue them onto their backdrop. And I've seen some tremendously effective photorealistic backdrops made. But for me, again, I wanted to come at it from an artistic impressionistic approach. So what I did was all of my backdrops were digitally painted. I had a friend who's a talented artist, and I provided reference photos, and she digitally painted everything in Photoshop. And then when she had it completed, I made a few edits. And then what I did was I applied a filter within Photoshop to make those backdrop scenes with the landforms and the clouds into like a more of an abstract looking scene. It wasn't photorealistic. It was more painterly and impressionistic. My particular philosophy is I like painted backdrops like that versus photorealistic because I think it blends better with our models in the foreground and the scenery. Again, that's nothing to take away from those guys who do the photorealistic backdrops because, again, some of those guys are super talented. They blend them in great. But for me, I wanted just to give a feel, an impression of a sky or a background or an environment. So don't feel as modelers that we have to always do photorealism. We can do things like our backdrops that are more abstract, and they'll come off just as good, in my opinion, as photorealism.
What advantage do you think that gives you for the scene?
It focuses the viewer more on the foreground, I believe, because I again, when I go to a layout and I see photorealistic backdrops, I think what the modelers are trying to achieve is a real sense of distance. Okay, where you can look from the model portion in the foreground to the backdrop, i.e. the background, and you see great distance, whether it's a road or a field or what have you. For me, I wanted to have a backdrop that, again, was more painterly. I wanted it to be, in a sense, not paid attention to, not forgotten. I mean, I want it there, but I just didn't want it to have too much emphasis, I guess I should say. Now, some modelers, I've got some close friends where just a pale blue painted backdrop is their approach, and they feel strongly about it. They don't want to have any photorealism. They don't want to have anything painterly. They just want to have a pale blue backdrop because for them, they really want to emphasize the foreground, and they don't want to create any sense of depth or distance. Now, I didn't want to go that far, but I did want that painterly look. And I took that cue, Ray, from when I was doing my work over the decades in my profession. And I was fortunate enough to work on some different museum displays with other talented artists. And inevitably, a lot of the backgrounds were, well, I should say exclusively, they were almost all painted. And that intrigued me because why did a lot of these museum designers go with painterly backdrops? I'm not sure why that was, but I did notice it, and I did like it because they were extremely well done. I think they do that to control the narrative in the scene versus having to go out and photograph it, which would be much more difficult.
I think it may be also like kind of like, I'm going back to photography here, but it's like controlling depth of field. It's like bringing blur to your background and bringing your foreground to if you have less detail in that background, now it's like blurring out that background enough where the tension really comes to the foreground. And then that's where the eye starts to go because they're not looking at that super detail in the back. It's now on the subject.
Right. And again, if you go back and you think in terms of when you go to the theater and you see a play, most of the backdrops are going to be conceptual. They're not photorealistic. So again, nothing against photorealism, but I liked that approach. So that's what I feel has some validity too. And it's worth pointing out. Of course, modelers can do whatever suits their fancy, but it's interesting to talk about for sure.
Yeah. Again, I think that's trying to figure out where the human eye goes to and what they're paying attention, what you want to draw attention to. And I love that theater tie-in. Very basic sets. They don't go into incredible detail. And then you watch, like, even television, if they do have that, they set their shots in a way where that background is non-distracting, right? That the subject is what the eye is going to, and not necessarily the things in the background. If you have things in the background, then the mind doesn't even pay attention to the dialogue. and I think there's something to be thought about to take that to a layout. If they're constantly looking at a very highly detailed backdrop, they may miss the train going by because their eyes and everything else are back looking at, trying to find little things that they're distracted by.
That's exactly right. I mean, you just nailed it. I mean, just for me, the backdrop should be supplemental to the actors, which are the trains. And like I said, as time goes on, I'm evolving into a modeler who's even thinking about, blending in, using scenery to be more of a blend in versus a lot of detail. Because again, I'd rather have the detail on the moving actors versus the detail everywhere in the scenery or the backdrop. And another thing is in terms of lighting. Now, in the theater, lighting is extremely important. Every theater has a lighting director because they need to have coordinated lighting for transitions, scenes, specific scenes, colors to set mood, all these different things. So on my layout, I tried to emulate the outside by using a unique way that I use my LED lights. I've got 12 2x2 LED panels, and I call them clouds because in essence, that's what they are. And they run the full length of my the linear feet on my layout it's only 42 feet. But those 12 lights are mixed. 7 of them are on one lighting circuit. The other 5 are on a second lighting circuit. And then my friends at IAIS Scale built me an Arduino module where between those 2 circuits, and the lights are intermixed along the 42 linear feet. Between those 2 circuits, the Arduino varies the dimming intensity, both in terms of randomly, in terms of the intensity and the length of how they come up and down. So in effect, what I'm creating, I call it a cloud shadow simulator. What I'm trying to do is give the impression that clouds are moving across the landscape, and thus the light is changing on the layout. So that's another theatrical approach that I've incorporated into the layout. And that's one thing I don't see too many modelers trying to incorporate into their layouts. But something like that could really make a big impact, because I'm telling you, the effect is incredible. If you were to see my backdrop, I've tried to reflect my favorite type of day, which is a sunny day with a lot of fluffy clouds that are spaced apart. And I'm no meteorologist, so I don't know the terms for all of this, but people can use their mind's eye and see a day where lots of fluffy white clouds spread out, moving across the landscape and casting shadows, varied shadows as they move. That's what I'm trying to represent on the layout. And with this setup that I have with these 2 circuits and the random dimming up and down at different time rates, it achieves that effect just incredibly. It's a really neat effect. But again, that's bringing the outside inside,
which is a challenge because it's hard to emulate that one light bulb that's 94 million miles away, that we get to see outside, that does amazing things because it's 94 million miles away. And we get to, it casts one shadow in one direction. And, so it's always difficult, and it doesn't have anything to really reflect back on, like backdrops, and trying to figure that out so you don't build double shadows. So lighting is definitely a challenge. It's neat to find ways to play with it and sell it and make it look right.
Yeah. And with this cloud shadow simulator, I've been able to achieve the effect of moving clouds, give the impression of moving clouds. And I'm sorry for the audience to have to keep hearing me say impression or impressionistic, but it's probably the best term I can use for what we're talking about. Yeah, the effect is very effective, and it just adds one more level to the operational fun. In addition, the Milan branch ran evening shifts too. So I've installed blue LEDs and attached them to just a slide dimmer so I can simulate night operations, either full moon or no moon.
Oh, wow.
Or anything in between. So with the dimmer, I can dim the blue up and down, and the blue is very effective for simulating night, but you're still able to see what you're doing, so you're not knocking over scenery. And
That's very
things.
important. Yeah.
But it also requires that you have a lot of LEDs lighting up buildings and signs and vehicles and things like that. So I've got a lot of work ahead of me, but I enjoy that kind of thing, and I think over time it's going to be very effective. Then another aspect of the theatrical approach I think would be fun to talk about is the audible aspects.
Right.
When you go to the theater, there's lots of music, lots of sound effects, lots of ambient noise. And that's the type of thing that I think is important to have on our layouts too, if tastefully done, because I've gone to layouts in the past where sounds were incorporated, but they were, too loud. And the effect can have the opposite impact where you're like, okay, this is annoying. And I know some modelers don't even like sound in their locomotives, but I'm speaking to those modelers who want not only the sounds in the locomotives, but also realistic sounds, trackside and ambient sounds tastefully done at specific locations on the layout so that it feels, again, that you're in a specific place. You have that sense of place. And with that, I've got on my small layout, I've got three different ambient sounds that I have. I have an interstate overpass where I've downloaded a variety of different passing trucks and cars, and then I bring them into a free audio editor like Audacity, and then created a sound file that plays on a loop. So when the train is going over under the interstate, I should say, you can hear the road noise. And the other sounds I have is when the trains go across the Rock River, there's a spill dam just upstream. So you hear that continual rushing of water. And then I incorporated bird sounds in there. So that gives you almost a Zen effect as you go across the Rock River. And then my final ambient sound is in a future location where there's going to be a scrap metal dealer. So I'll have some industrial sounds there, like the cranes working and things like that. Now, ambient sound to me has to be done very tastefully. It has to be low level so that when you're by it, you hear it. But when you're moving across the layout in other locations, you don't hear it because I don't want it to be overdone and annoying. I've tested it out. It works pretty good. But again, that adds another theatrical approach.
Are you activating those sounds as the train gets to those places, or are they on a continuous loop?
They're in a continuous loop, but they're far enough apart from each other. It's only three sounds, but they're far enough that you don't hear them unless you're on top of them.
Right.
But in addition to those, the only other triggered sound that I have is I've got three curves on the layout, and each one of those curves have two Iowa Scaled Engineering flange squeal sound systems in place. So when the train is going through the curves, you can hear the random flange squeal. But again, that's another sound that has to be tastefully done. Even though trains will create flange squeal at almost any location on the line, you want to use a system like Iowa Scaled in specific areas so modelers get the flavor of the flange squeal sound, but it doesn't get to the point where it'll drive you all crazy because it's constant. So that's another neat way to add trackside sound in addition to the locomotives.
I just recently operated on a layout, Drew James, Canada Spokane and Pacific Railroad, and he had his Iowa Scaled Engineering flange squealer set up on a nice curve that was coming out of the Spokane yard and wrapping around, and he's got it nearly at the perfect level. It's not where you're piercing your eardrums, but it's enough to know, hey, I can hear a train. And from where I was on the opposite side. It sounded like it was in the distance, like here it's coming. You can hear them coming around that corner way, way away. But reality, I probably could have reached my arm out and touched it, but it was just that, applied some distance and compression by being able that level down low.
That is so neat. And boy, you've got great transitions here, Ray, because the next thing I was going to mention was one more audio effect that I'll be incorporating, and a lot of small layout owners can incorporate this effect into their layouts, and it's the low rumble of the locomotives. As we all know, sound in our locomotives has improved over the years, especially since scale sound systems have come out with their excellent speakers,
right?
That give us some aspect of low frequency. But just in recent times, I went to my friend James McNabb's layout and operated on his small switching layout. And we were operating with a locomotive that had one of Scale Sound Systems speakers in it. So we were already enjoying really neat locomotive sound. But then at one point, about halfway through the op session, James said, "Hey, check this out." And he turned on a small subwoofer that he had another decoder tied in to the main locomotive that we were operating with. And my goodness, initially I could hear the subwoofer, but literally after less than a minute, you can't identify where the subwoofer is sounding any longer. And you think your mind transitions to where you think it's coming directly from the locomotive on the layout, but it's only the low frequencies. And I said I have to have that on my layout. So that's one thing I'll be incorporating. And that's one more audio aspect that at least small layout owners can incorporate into their operations, again, to get a much more realistic trackside experience. I did talk to JT Burke, the owner of Scale Sound Systems, about that effect. And he said that the low frequencies aren't meant to necessarily be heard like you would think it would be, but they're more meant to be felt. And that was very intriguing because, like, when you're trackside, you definitely hear that bass reverberation, but it's more of a feel than an ear thing. And I can attest, when we were operating on James's layout, and this is not something that was turned way up. This was very subtle, but boy, I tell you, once your brain makes that transition to hearing the low frequencies in combination with the mid and high frequencies coming from the locomotive, it's just paradigm shifting in terms of your trackside feel, I should say.
Yeah, it's hitting all the elements, right? The sound, the feel, the only thing we're missing is smell, right? And then, everything else is, we start to get that, the visuals, we get all of that, and put a proto throttle in your hand, and then you get the feel, right? So you got your hand on the throttle, and
yes.
So it's about bringing the person, that either yourself or your visitor, to that time and place, in that era, in that spot, and make it feel like you're right there. And that sells the whole thing.
It is. And that's kind of a good summation. And you mentioned the proto throttle. The proto throttle is another thing that, again, to me, it's like a prop in a play. It's something you use to enhance your experience of the play. And the proto throttle certainly does that, because it virtually all of the users will tell you it puts you in the cab. It gives you an in the cab experience, and it just has that effect. And one last thing I'll mention is another aspect is the play value. Once we get into ops, let's say you've got all these effects going on. We've got, for my layout, we've got this impressionistic feel. We've got the actors, the trains moving through with the lighting and the sounds, and we're getting a real sense of place. And then we're adding things like the proto throttle. And in addition to that, I incorporate a real riding conductor into my ops. And what that is it's just a little HO figure that has a little piece of tin in an L shape glued to the bottom of one of his feet. And then I use micro neodymium magnets that I glue and paint and weather to the cars and the locomotives. So the conductor actually rides on the locomotive and the cars as we're switching, just like the actual conductor would be making his ground moves. And there's embedded neodymium magnets in the ground at certain locations so that when the conductor's on the ground, he's standing, but then you can easily pop him on and off a car or a locomotive. And where a lot of modelers will take the time to either have a time value for when the conductor's doing certain tasks on the ground, or they'll just slightly pause for when to simulate that the conductor's moving somewhere or throwing a switch or counting cars or whatever. On the Milan branch, we actually have an actual figure, just like the gamers use, to add that play value to the operations. And so you physically have to keep track of your conductor, and you have to have him in the correct position. Now, for some modelers, that's over the top, too much. For others, they might really embrace it because it's makes it more like a miniature game approach.
Yeah, I like the word simulation. We talked about it with Dustin Witten when we had the Talking Ops with Don Iris episode. And this definitely brings a little more physical element to what we were talking about, which was slowing down ops and making it realistic. And Dustin had mentioned, observe when you go trackside and you're watching a rail crew switch, notice how long it takes for a conductor to walk the cars, or for them to apply the handbrake, or for them to uncouple, or for them to hook the air hoses up, and notice all those things. And I think this really comes into play a lot more with smaller layouts, ones like mine, and in smaller switching layouts where you want to make the ops last. It's not about getting the job done, because when the job's done, you go home. It's like, that's no fun, right? I want to make this last. I've traveled over to somebody's house. I want to spend some time. I want to run this layout. I want to slow this thing down a little bit and enjoy it. And those are ways to do it. And you got a great way to do it there to add that physical element of having something that you can see and do to eat up that time, just to add to that whole simulation effect and make it a little more realistic.
Exactly. I mean, let's be honest, conductors have a lot of work to do, either on the cars or on the ground. And that should be incorporated into small layout ops, in my opinion. And this is one way of doing it. And for me, it just adds a real fun aspect to the ops. And I'm hopeful that the guys at Iowa Scaled will be coming out in the next year or so with their sound conductor. That's going to be another little device that will make ops for the conductor more engaging. It'll be a little sound generator. So you can have the specific sounds like cranking the brakes, the brake wheel on cars to set them, and a variety of other sounds, multiple coupler crash and releases, so that the sound's generated from the location where you're working rather than from the locomotive. So things like that will add even more layered to it. One other thing that I'm going to eventually incorporate into the ops is what I call situation cards. And other modelers have talked about that in the past, but things that, again, it's play value, things like playing cards, where if you flip one over, it's a situation that the crew has to deal with. And those could be a bad car set out, wrong routed car, maybe a car derailed and they have to pull it back up on the rails, or a high railer comes through. Just a variety of things that could happen during the op session, but it kind of throws a wrench in there for the operators to make it more fun.
Well, one I've done on my layout, I had a job that's a switching job, but there was a couple different ways to go about it, and I wanted to shake it up a little bit. So I added a card 1 through 6 with all the options for that job, and there's a dice or a die, I guess, sitting there, and that operator will actually go over and roll the die, and whatever they get on the die is the job that they'll do that night.
Yeah, that's cool.
trying to just shake it up a little bit, make a little bit different, different approach to it, and make it a little bit more random. And I think that's what you're doing with the situation cards too. You're building that randomness to the whole operation.
That's it. And just making it more fun, more like you're playing a game. But again, the focus is on the trains and the switching, and it's going to be a lot of fun.
Absolutely. We got a question of the month to get to here, which ties into all of this that we've been talking about. And the question of the month was, what part of your layout tells the most about its time and place? And you and I came up with this question when we were talking about this topic, because this is really about taking the person to that era, that geographic location, and getting the actual feel of being where you're modeling. And we'll take a listen to some of these answers here and see what folks had to say.
Sounds great.
Our first answer comes to us from Joey.
Hey, Ray, my name is Joey from Springdale, Arkansas. The Penn Reading Industrial Division is a fictional operation that bridges the East Coast with the Anthracite Railroads in Pennsylvania. The fictional town of Emma represents a post-World War II railroad industrial town that rests against a tree backdrop, giving you the feel of being deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The layout shows railroad operations during the steam diesel transition era.
Yeah, so great answer from Joey, talking about, the Appalachian Mountains and getting that feel of being within that area, the tree line, the providing that feel of being in the mountains.
Very cool.
Our next answer comes from Michael.
Hey, my name is Michael Spohr. I'm from Houston, Texas. I would say one part that tells the most about the time and place of my layout isn't even the layout itself. It is the full environment of the layout room. During operating sessions, I play period music for the years I model, and I have a period outfit that I wear. I wear a reproduction 1959 Chicago White Sox hat I wear for operating sessions, and I have an Eastern Airlines T-shirt with the logos that they wore in 59 to fly to Chicago. And for 1990s op sessions, I have a bunch of mid-90s T-shirts from concerts that I have, and also hats from the 1990s that are appropriate for the sports teams of that time.
Well, talk about theater, Scott. He's putting on the full theater there. He's got music. He's got costumes. Mike's going completely into it.
That's what I'm talking about. That is really cool. I really appreciate what he was saying there, because if you can add to your enjoyment by clothes or music, hey, more power to you. I have a friend, Trevor, who operates on British style modular layouts, and he likes to dress the part as a period conductor, and it's a lot of fun.
Absolutely. All right, let's hear from Ralph Heiss.
Hey, Ray, this is Ralph Heiss from South Plainfield, New Jersey, and I'd like to answer the question of the month, which is what part of your layout tells the most about its time and place, and those would be my two custom-built car float bridges that proudly proclaim Lehigh Valley across them, which symbol to anyone going up and down the Hudson River that this was the eastern end of the railroad. And while they've been gone since about the time Conrail took over the Lehigh Valley Railroad, just like the Long Island Railroad float bridges that still do exist in Long Island City, Queens, that said Long Island, they're a very symbolic part of New York Harbor railroading, and it's the centerpiece of my layout.
Yeah, that's city railroading stuff that we kind of forget about, and it's still going on down there. But there weren't big bridges or tunnels at one point. They were floating all these cars across the mighty Hudson.
I love the water aspect, of railroading, and having the transfers via the water is so neat. And some of that history that you read about in like the New York area, where they all had these tugs with railroad identification on them, and that's an aspect of model railroading that is so fascinating.
Well, staying on that same theme, let's listen to Steve McEwen.
Hi, Ray. It's Steve McEwen over in the UK. And as you know, I'm trying to recreate a slice of Brooklyn with my layouts. And one of the things that I found that really sets the scene and defines the era are the figures and the vehicles that are placed on the layout. Now, whilst the trains obviously are of a certain company, in my case, the New York and Atlantic, which show that it's set on Long Island, I think by having the right figures, the ones that are correctly dressed for the era that you are modelling, and also that have the ethnic range for the area that you're modelling, are very, very important and really do set the scene, as do the vehicles. It's little things like making sure that you've got a yellow taxi if you're modelling the New York area, and a New York Transit bus and an NYPD police car. These are all things that when people look at them, and in combination with the railways and the buildings, they can say, oh yeah, that's that part of that city. And I hope that I've managed to recreate that.
Yeah, it's about taking the elements of that era and, being able to pull them in and give you visual cues.
Now I want to see his layout.
Yeah, for sure.
That sounds great. I need to see pictures.
Yeah, for sure. All right, let's hear from Ben.
G'day, Ray. My name is Ben. I'm from Newcastle in Australia. The place on my layout that sets the scene is the level crossing. My layout is a shunting layout, about 2.5 metres long, so just over 8 feet, and the level crossing is the first scene off the fiddle yard. When the trains come into this part of the layout, they have to stop, and the crew has to hop out and get into a relay hut to activate the bells and lights for the crossing. Relay huts have been replaced in the modern era across a lot of the network in Sydney, Australia, which is where the layout is set by more modern technology. The level crossing itself, having no gates and just lights and bells. In the modern era, they would have a gate as well, even for a little industrial line like this. And the cars that are waiting, cars are a great way of showing an era. For me, it's 1979, as I said, in Sydney. And the other side of the crossing, once the train gets through, there is a lower quadrant semaphore signal, which is prototypical to this part of the world and also to this particular system in Australia. And the whole lot combined go together to make up the whole scene, and it sets the era nicely. Love listening to the show. Thanks very much.
Well, with all the technology advances, especially with grade crossings, and I love grade crossings, especially, activated grade crossings. But with all that technology, there's some eras where that technology didn't exist. And Ben's talking about one of them being 1979. I
love it. I love the fact that the train has to stop and they have to hop out and do their due diligence. And, that sort of thing is, and even with a really small footprint. I also enjoy that aspect of model building as well. And I hope to do something similar to what he's doing, but in O scale. So yeah, there's so many wonderful aspects of this hobby, so many interesting things. It's just so amazing.
Last but not least, let's hear what Dennis has to say.
Hey y'all, my name is Dennis Galucci, or N-Scale Train Boy. I'm from Wappingers Falls, New York. And the part of the BNCCS industrial switching layout that sets its time and place the most is either the rolling stock, being New York Central, Pennsylvania Railroad, New Haven Railroad, all patched out to Conrail or Penn Central, as well as being really heavily weathered, really sets it right in the Northeast in the 1970s and 80s. And the greenery really adds to that, being a lot of birch trees, pine trees, and other deciduous oak trees and things like that, as well as the bushes, really help to set it in the summer of 75 to 85 right in New York.
Yeah, again, grabbing all those elements and building scenery that matches your era and rolling stock telling a story as well.
Very cool. It reminds me of a video I just watched on YouTube recently showing an old Rock Island branch line in Iowa, and it was shot on Super 8 film and followed a train through a lot of little villages, but you could not see any ties because at that time of the rock, they didn't have the resources to do, to keep the line free of weeds and grass. And I thought, wouldn't it be neat to model one of these branch lines, because all you would see is rail. You wouldn't see any ties.
Yeah.
So again, so much in this hobby to enjoy and model for sure.
I want to thank everybody who submitted their answer to the question of the month by going to aroundthelayout.com/question. We'll have another question up there for next month here pretty soon, so stay tuned for that. Scott, want to thank you for coming by and sharing your outlook on the theatrical approach to model railroading. I'm sure everybody is going to get a little bit of something out of this podcast today.
Well, thank you, Ray. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Around the Layout. Learn more about today's episode, check out past shows, and much more on our website, aroundthelayout.com. Show your support by becoming an operating crew member at aroundthelayout.com/crew. Follow us on social media, aroundthelayout.com/social. And send us your feedback, aroundthelayout@gmail.com. Thanks for hanging out with us around the layout.